I'm Emily Bovier. I'm in the psychology department, and I really appreciate everyone being a part of this roundtable discussion. Over the last year, I have been getting a little bit more into neurodiversity and conducting some research on neurodiversity to set our students up for success in college. And so I'll share all of these notes with everyone. This is an idea that Maggie and I have been talking about in terms of formalizing this initiative a little bit more. Hopefully maybe a subcommittee on CELT, or COLT, I should say, through CELT as an initial starting point. I have lots of ideas, so we can start small and then start making connections throughout campus to set our students up for success. So this is my initial plan for this first meeting that we all have together. So the main goal is to create equity in the classroom for neurodiverse students. And even though, we can focus on the classroom, it's important to note that college success is not isolated to the classroom. So we'll talk about the importance of independent living, social life in conjunction with academic success. So basically we want to move beyond a deficit model. A lot of times when we talk about characteristics of neurodiverse students, there's a checklist of items that present challenges to them. And that's important to recognize, but we also want to focus on their assets, what gives them strength and resiliency, and obviously treat each student like an individual, right? We'll talk about prototypes, but it's important to focus beyond that. So I figured today we'll talk about just some big picture overview for folks that aren't familiar with this area about theoretical considerations. And then I have some big picture information on neurodiverse conditions, primarily autism spectrum disorders and ADHD, but not an exclusive list, right? So we have lots of individual differences. But what we'll see here is based on these theoretical considerations, if we start using universal design for learning and culturally responsive pedagogy that includes disability as part of diversity, it will reach many students. So what I'm really interested in talking about with everyone is based on these theoretical considerations and what our neurodiverse students quote unquote look like, is what should we be considering in terms of classroom environment, course policies, and learning assessments. And then I also want to hear from everyone about support that faculty might need, right? So we can talk about resources that are currently available. I'd like to start building a shared folder with resources. Lynn sent a book along to me. So if we could just have a set of resources that faculty can go to learn more, that would be great. Any other support to promote student success in this way, and think about how we can reach more faculty or offices on campus. Again, I have big ideas like with Advisement Center, coming up with like a peer mentoring program that would be really helpful for neurodiverse students. So this is sort of just a starting point where we can do a lot more with this. Any questions so far or comments? Yeah, Allison.
I think in accessibility resources, they do, or at least they did have some sort of a group called Connect.
Okay.
That Pat Devendorf facilitated.
Okay. Was that for the students?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So if we could sort of develop that a little bit more, make it more known to students, and maybe specialized focus on certain types of neurodiverse students, that might be good for them. Okay. Maggie, you want to switch it to the slides?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm presenting at a conference on this topic. So you are all my guinea pigs for some conference slides. So essentially, when we're talking about main theories, this may be familiar to many folks, or it might be new to some, but essentially what we're looking at in order to create equity in the classroom for neurodiverse students, universal design for learning, culturally relevant pedagogy. And again, that's the idea here that we're making an argument that we're going to include dis/ability in our definition of diversity. Inclusive teaching, we've had a lot of inclusive teaching initiatives on campus that fits well with this. And focusing on the social model of disability, this basically gets at the idea that a person is not disabled. They are disabled or handicapped by societal structures, right? So it's obstacles in their way that is creating a disability. And implications for our students, obviously not an exhaustive list, but sense of belongingness, persistence and retention, and working towards promoting social justice. So I think I can click, maybe not Maggie if you're in there. Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, we want to move beyond a deficit model, find ways to set our students up for success. Here's a list of some invisible disabilities, quote unquote. Today we can talk about autism spectrum disorders and ADHD, but it's also important to note, especially with, we're seeing an increased prevalence of anxiety and mood disorders in college students. And so it's important to consider this as part of the picture as well. And obviously there's learning differences and intellectual disabilities that will be specific to this as well. I'm going to focus primarily on autism spectrum and ADHD as just a starting point. If we want to continue with these type of workshops, we can talk more about other specific disorders. Will you switch it for me?
Yeah.
My little clicker doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. So with autism spectrum disorders, I have a lot of personal experience with this. My youngest brother, he's in his mid-30s. He has autism. He never went to college, so he does have some intellectual differences, and he did not go to college. But the way I think about this is we're considering it in the context of a college setting, but it's just socially responsible to think about everyday life, right? How can we reduce stigma? How can we promote equity in everyday life? So typically, again, I'm talking about prototypes, but everyone is different. Folks with autism spectrum disorders have challenges with neurotypical social communication and interactions. So again, there's that societal component, right? Neurotypical expectations like eye contact, tone of voice, body language, what is expected, quote unquote, from society. They may have difficulty reading body language and facial expressions. And as we're going through these, like, let's start thinking about what do we do in the classroom, or what are our policies? What does our environment look like that might pose challenges to someone who has these difficulties? They may have very repetitive behaviors or highly focused interests. Sensory reactivity is a big one. So lights, sounds, tactile information can really be a distraction to folks with autism spectrum disorders. And they're very hypersensitive to changes. So changes in routines can be really disruptive to folks with ASD. Thank you. So this article, I teach a class on neurodiversity, and this is an article that I go through with my students. It's incredibly helpful. So it did interviews with college students who are on the autism spectrum. And the key elements that these authors identified, and it gets at my general philosophy that education is just one component of college success. So we can't consider just their ability to participate in classes, do well on assignments, and develop study skills in isolation. We also have to consider success with independent living and student life, right? The degree to which they're engaged with these elements of student life. So what these authors identified is the things that we can focus on for our students on the autism spectrum. Benefits, right? Strong memory. And again, these are identified by the students themselves. What are their strengths? I'm also conducting a study right now, asking students to identify some of these things, whether or not they identify as neurodiverse, but what are their strengths in these three domains? So very focused precision, dedication, analytic skills, powers of observation, very sincere. My brother is not capable of hurting someone's feelings. He doesn't know how. He just does not have that ability to intentionally hurt someone's feelings. Very sincere. Willingness to listen to others. So there's a lot of strengths that we can focus on. And even some of the elements that are considered challenges, if we do right by these students, we can turn them into strengths, right? Like routine focused and attention to detail. So through these interviews, some challenges that the students themselves identified is struggling with new situations and unexpected changes. Exhausting but necessary social contexts. So these social interactions for students that, and this is a term that folks might not be familiar with, but the idea of masking, right, can really lead to physical and mental exhaustion. Processing information and time management can come in fits and starts. A lot of students have doubts about disclosure, right? Willingness and feeling comfortable with disclosing what they're going through. And so all of these challenges, if you look at like what the theory is, central cohesion, theory of mind, the ability to understand another person's point of view. But I think the biggest component is stress. Stress because these students are self-aware. They understand what their challenges are. They're very vigilant to their differences and are trying to mask their autistic tendencies, if you will, quote unquote, can really be exhausting and can lead to a lot of stress. So as a result, we see these comorbid mental health issues: stress, anxiety, fatigue, feeling overwhelmed, and loneliness. Another term related to this is autism burnout. So this is a new concept over the last few years. My brother has experienced this recently. We had a lot of family stress in the last year or so, and we kept thinking, we're like, wow, he's doing great. He was so resilient, but he was masking. He wasn't engaging in his self-soothing routines because he was helping take care of the family, and eventually it led to burnout. So you see decline in executive functioning, decline in memory, decline in self-care, things like that, that are a function of existing in this neurotypical society and not being able to feel like they can be their authentic selves. Okay, so these authors identified support recommendations. Personalized approaches, this is for college students specifically, involve the student in preparing for transitions, safe and transparent environments with sufficient planning and clear communication. So think about how that relates to our class policies. Academic accommodations, coaching is really beneficial. Adequate psychosocial support. And so this is where I'd like to connect maybe with advising, the advising center or other groups, because what students want is they want social support groups, but not to learn how to be neurotypical. That's not the point. The point is to just exchange their experiences, have that actual support, and making sure that they have leisure activities and sufficient rest, right? So this goes for everybody, right? But it's especially relevant for folks who might be more mentally and physically exhausted based on living in a neurotypical societal structure. Okay, questions on autism spectrum? All right, so go ahead. Yeah.
From the chat, Rebecca, do you want to unmute and ask?
Sorry, were you talking to me or to somebody else in the?
To you.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I can't tell. I had a question, I guess, and maybe it goes different, into a different spot in your presentation. But as you're speaking about the stresses of doing these social interactions for a person who is somewhere on the autism spectrum, for the classroom instructors among us, I just find myself thinking about all the group work that I ask my students to do. And I've always worried about this, right? But, what do we know about the cost, the pro and the con, the cost benefit analysis of having significant portions of the classroom, put into small groups to do exercises together?
That's a really good question. And so maybe what we can do as opposed to launching into ADHD is we can pause and go to, if you click to a couple slides for me, Maggie, just our general discussions about, yes, our pedagogical considerations. Maybe let's go to the next one. Yeah, learning assessments, right? How we do learning assessments in class. So I think this is a good chance for us to chat. So the question is, how do you balance group work in classes? Because there are benefits, right? So it's not that we should completely isolate neurodiverse students from engaging in social interactions. I think the biggest aspect of it has to do with what's called the hidden curriculum. Folks heard of the hidden curriculum? So things that students could be learning that aren't explicit learning objectives. And a lot of that comes from social interactions with peers, right? Or you as a professor or the advisor or any staff that you're working with. And so I think if you are aware of that and can have concrete guidelines for those group interactions and consider the degree to which you are grading assessment based on those group interactions, that's a good thing too. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. I think it's a great question, but that's why we have a group like this. So if anyone wants to jump in, yeah, Lynn.
I have a son with autism, just so everybody knows. He's 23, he's in graduate school, and he's studying autism for his PhD.
Good for him.
So if you read an article by him in 10 years, that's my son. Anyway, so I'm very aware of my students with autism in my class, even if they don't self-identify, I can point them out in 5 minutes, right? So if you have questions about, what you can do to support students, I'm happy to help with that. But with group assignments, what I think helps, not just typical students with autism, but other students, is having very clear guidelines about what they need to accomplish in this class period. Here are your questions, boom, 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 in a row. The other thing that I know helped my son, and certainly will help our students, is if at all possible, keep the same groups. My son has change is impossible for him. And he's like, all of a sudden, if he's put with another person, he's got to navigate all these other social issues, which makes him feel very uncomfortable. And then his focus is not here, it's way over somewhere else.
Absolutely.
So if you can keep the same group, right, or keep the same group for 5 weeks and then switch the group, that gives them some consistency. It gives them some notion of, this person knows me. I don't have to go through the same process of, my name is Daniel. What is your major? Oh, my major is this. And then you spend all this time trying to establish a relationship when you should be focusing on your work. So if those are things I think help all of our students.
Absolutely.
But having very clear guidelines and very clear questions, like this is exactly what, and just say, talk about something, is not going to help.
Yeah,
That's
and
just
that
not
can
real.
be challenging because I've had moments in class where I recognize an impromptu moment where I'm like, okay, this is a good opportunity for students to group together, but then it lacks structure and it can really impact. So then the student with autism might become very process oriented. They're focused on the process of
Right.
engaging in this social interaction process, not the content.
Right.
Or if you're expecting them to gain content out of this hidden curriculum, social interactions, the way other people respond, judging your tone of voice, that's supposed to signal something important or relevant, then they can get lost as well. So I don't think the answer is completely removing group work, but just be very, and this is where the universal design for learning comes in, be very specific about your intentions, the learning objectives, consistency with group work.
And Teresa dropped in the chat, that group work does need to have very specific guidelines, expectations, and outcomes regardless, but being able to think about how explicit disclosure benefits all. Yeah, so that structure, in UDL is always a, key component to equitable and accessible learning.
Right, and then it removes that pressure to disclose because you've evened the playing field, right, as much as you can. And so then a student doesn't have to self-identify if they don't want to. Although, like Lynn said, I think with people who have experience with autism, you can learn very quickly who might be on the spectrum in terms of how they're functioning in class. That is a great discussion point for our learning assessments. If we're going to consider participation as part of a grade, how we assign a number to it. This applies to just in general, regardless of who the student is. But special consideration if we're trying to, if you think about the number of times a verbal response is given in class, especially if it's impromptu and not a structured thing of, I know I'm going to participate in the last 15 minutes of class, it can really inadvertently discriminate against certain students. So how about we can stick with learning assessments? These are some points that I have thought of that have come up in the readings that I have done. If we think about extended time on exams and quizzes or writing assignments, presentations are another big one. A lot of what I've read is allowing for alternative formats, right? So what's in italics here are things that we can consider for the above learning assessments. Are there alternative ways that we can assess Can we have flexibility in due dates? Does anyone have any thoughts about these assessments? Or something that you're thinking of now that you've got this framework for understanding a neurodiverse student who might be on the autism spectrum?
Rebecca Peters? Go for it.
Yeah, sorry. So me again. I mean, I'm just so glad you're doing this because all of this has just been on my mind for so long, but I'm not myself like a neurodiversity researcher, right? I just, have my own experiences with people in the world and then, teaching for a long time and everything. Could you explain a little bit more about the concerns about presentations for these folks? I absolutely get the group work stuff, and I found it very, very interesting, the sort of enhanced stressors that go with that you were speaking of earlier. And for my part, the group work in my classes is always incredibly structured. So I'm, and always has been. But presentations, right? Like I've come across, that being a particular sticking point for students. And I go back and forth with all of these things, trying to figure out when is the benefit just no longer there for a student such that we should do it differently or everyone should do it differently, right? And about presentations, is it a particularly stressful thing? It must be, right? Like more than for the average person.
Sure.
It's typical to stand up and give a prepared presentation with very carefully outlined,
Well, I think there's a couple components to it. Obviously, yes, presentations are stressful. They're stressful for any student, but it kind of goes back to what Lynn was saying. If you have clear guidelines about what's expected, that's really what's going to set a student up for success. What I think more about presentation is how we grade a presentation, how we assess a presentation, like tone of voice, eye contact, things like that. We might not be able to, again, that's hidden curriculum stuff, like your ability to convey through your speech information. Do we give more credit if the student is able to speak freely versus reading off of slides, right? There's a lot of these very intricate things that we need to consider when we are assessing something like a participation. Again, it's not that we remove that as an element of our course. I toyed around with alternative formats. So this was also during the times of COVID. So it sort of worked well where I let students pick in person or online through Zoom. And not only online through Zoom, but they could also just do a recording. So they could either be in real time on Zoom or do a recording. And it was a 50-50 split. I was actually surprised. I thought maybe more students would choose the online option because people might perceive it as easier, right? So that's the thing with universal design for learning. It's not that there's this myth that certain components are easier. And it depends on what your objectives are for the assignment itself, right? If the objective is to be able to respond to questions in real time, right, then an online pre-recorded presentation might not fit that learning objective, right? So you have to think about what's the main purpose of the assignment. Anyone have any other thoughts or experiences with presentations? And again,
so what are the special concerns a neurodiverse student would have about presentations? It sort of sounds to me like everything you've said is what a neurotypical person would be concerned about, only to perhaps a greater degree.
Possibly, yeah. And so this is where like having the qualitative research with students and getting their input, because it is difficult to pinpoint an exact one or two things. So I think a lot of it is if the presentation doesn't have enough clear-cut guidelines. Some students might be able to excel on a presentation, even if the guidelines are not as clear-cut, right? Specific learning objectives that are supposed to be achieved. And I think the other big one is how we evaluate their presentation style, right? So it's more about how we're assessing a style of presentation that we have to keep in mind when working with a neurodiverse student. And again, I'm still new to this perspective as well. I thought about it as a professor, but in terms of getting into it, in terms of what the literature says that we can identify as certain stressors or unique considerations, a lot of it is just sort of reading the literature and then starting to think about my own experiences. So having a discussion like this is really helpful because then I can hear from other folks about what they've experienced in the classroom. And maybe we can come to a more comprehensive understanding of it. Yeah.
And just to pipe in also, here's one of the strengths of people on the autism spectrum. My son loves giving presentations
Yeah.
because he gets to command the whole classroom.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they used to say is like, they're like little professors. They
Yeah.
just talk at you for
Mhm.
20 minutes, and at the end, you're like, I'm here, hello, are you in there somewhere, right? Because they just, my son would talk at us, he wouldn't talk with us.
Right.
So the presentations, I think, it could be, it's a double-edged sword, right? So you
Mhm.
get some students, and one of the considerations I've seen people is, when they go too long,
Mhm.
they're too detailed,
Mhm.
right? Or they miss the point of the assignment.
Right.
And they're going off on this trajectory, and you're like, wait a minute. So if you interrupt them and say, okay, that's great, but what about this? It's gonna throw them all off.
Absolutely.
So they could do very well at presentations if they had very clear guidelines, they've practiced, they have
Mhm.
notes.
Mhm.
I told one student, if you can't look people in the eye, put a little sticky note in the back of the room above people's heads and look at the sticky note.
Exactly.
Don't look at them or look at their forehead, and
Mhm.
don't look at, you don't have
Yep.
to look at them in the eye.
Mhm.
You can look at the sticky note at the back of the room. But, and then scan the room, put 3 sticky notes, scan, 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 and then you can just pretend you're not even in the room.
Exactly.
So there's a powerful way the presentation could be very, very well done.
Exactly.
Actually.
Yep.
You know?
I'll share another thing that I did. So part of my presentation requirement for students in my seminar is to then write up a summary of the discussion that we had afterwards. My student, he even said, he's like, can he couldn't multitask.
Yeah.
So what I ended up doing was passing out index cards to my students. They talked in class, we had the discussion, he did fantastic, he fielded responses. But his ability to then retain that information, to then do a quick write-up summary as part of the reflection of the presentation. I had students write their comments on index cards as well. And then I ended up doing that for all my students, right? So there's that universal design for learning approach of recognizing as the professor, like, whoops, that is a very challenging thing. They're completely capable of doing it, but because of that structure, yeah. So there's lots of things to consider. Did you have a point?
I was just gonna say, you mentioned 2 things like eye contact and not reading off slides, and I know that those are grading, that's on the rubric
Yeah,
that for the presentation rubric that we use as a school, which is interesting, and my son is on the autism spectrum, and he can do very well with presentations, but he has to be very prepared, and he's probably gonna read off the slide, but he's prepared the slide and he, whatever. He's actually on the other end where his personality is his strength. It's his cognitive processing that's not
Right.
as
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah.
But yeah, just the eye, and you would expect, business world, right? Eye contact, handshake.
Yep.
Being able to have a conversation and when you're doing a presentation, not reading it off the slide, not having a lot of detail on the slide and, whatever, being able to explain just a graphic and not have anything written about it. So
Right.
there is some merging to do there.
Very good point.
I wonder if another thing to help with the preparedness would be to be able to meet with the professor in advance of the presentation, which would probably be a good thing for everyone
Sure.
to do.
Yeah. And I think most of us do encourage our students to come and talk with us. And then but then it's like, then that gets into the disclosure element, right? Or that social interaction component of it. Some students are going to take you up on that opportunity and others aren't. You could make it a required part. I've done that before. But then if we think about support for faculty, that's a lot of time, right? I did that once outside of my class hours for each individual student, and it really builds up, right? So we have to protect our time as well, and understand, right? So that requirement of it, we'd have to build that into our time management too. Yeah.
One thing that I've done, particularly in a freshman first year seminar signature course, was I built into the class practice presentations. Specifically for that class, because it was first year students, they may not have done a presentation in high school, previously to coming to the university. And so, that kind of structure, especially, I think in a lot of ways, we expect presentations to be perfectly polished and refined and, when they enter into the classroom, but if we don't always build in the opportunities for students to practice that in that environment, it can, go south quickly. And I think, adding in that structure, that practice time could help catch, as Lynn was saying, some of those, maybe the focus of the presentation is off, right? And, could help troubleshoot that before the actual assessment, right? So kind of offering, that support as well. Teresa on Zoom had a comment. Teresa, did you want to share?
Well, I'm just going back, and as I'm listening to everything you all are talking about, a lot of this goes back to, and I'm sure you all know this, learning theory, instructional design theory, thinking about some of the different things that you all talked about pertaining to providing expectations and all of that, and thinking about Gagne's 9 events of instruction and how that is very structured to help students regardless of modality or regardless of differences, because good instruction does help when you try to frame all of that. And again, somebody already did mention the rubrics. Again, that's so critical for all students, so they all know where they go and all of those different strategies and finding balance. So everything you're all talking about is just good instruction. But yes, we do want to make sure we can be as inclusive as possible, regardless of a student's difference, whether it's neurodiverse or other things. So just my 2 cents.
Another strategy that I got from another person who teaches GST courses for kind of managing like the instructor time that goes into it. Sometimes if you can work it into the class schedule, like taking a few days to set aside for individual meetings with students where they sign up for a portion of the class.
I ended up having to do that. It's just, you just build it into the schedule. And then that could potentially disrupt a student. That happened to one of my students where he could not wrap his head around the fact that we didn't have class Wednesday, Friday, because there were the individual meetings. And he missed his meeting inadvertently because of that. So that's a great point, but then another layer to keep in mind as the professor, how that can possibly disrupt students too. It's the pros cons, right? It's like the pro of the individual meeting, and then recognizing that the student might miss, and you have to just have mercy on them, right? They might miss an appointment because of that change, the disruption in the routine, or the added stress that it caused them to then, that impacts their then cognitive processing, right? We all know that stress impacts cognitive processing.
I'm so sorry I left my bag.
Oh, yeah, come on in. Front and center. So we've talked about learning assessments. Can we go back a couple slides and talk about like class environments? Oops, sorry. There we go. This class environment. Yeah. So I always think about this for my students too, but if we're particularly thinking about neurodiverse students, and I know we haven't talked about ADHD yet, but this is another big component of it. If we think about, and these are things that unfortunately we don't have a lot of control over, right? But if we have enough manpower, we can start making arguments for the way spaces are renovated and organized for students, right? So fluorescent lighting, not so great. Think about the acoustics of the room, right? And how that can impact a student's ability to focus. If you have other students talking, some people might be more prone to distraction than others. And again, this applies not only to autism spectrum, ADHD, and a lot of people too, right? Physical layout of the room, if you think about where seats are and their ability to see the screen, to see you. Some might use focus on your face and lip reading too, problems with masks, right? So there's a lot of elements about the class environment that we can consider and how it might differentially impact neurodiverse students. Yes, it has an impact on everybody, but where are areas that it might differentially impact neurodiverse students? Anyone have any thoughts or input on that?
Well, I was going to say that, my brother is neurotypical in different ways, and he has an auditory processing disorder and, uses a hearing aid and so forth. And so every time, I hear professors, say, I'm just gonna put on my professor voice and not use the microphone, I kind of cringe because I'm thinking, there are students, and I've had students who are hard of hearing, who, really rely on that amplification of that noise. And so, obviously in a small classroom, the necessity of that is different than in a bigger, larger lecture space. But, I think it's, important to understand that not all disabilities, right, or all accessibility concerns are visible, and to make sure that we're trying to equal the playing field there, right? I had students who did rely on my lips to read, and this was pre-COVID, so it was, we didn't have issues with masking, but and if I were walking around the room a lot, they would have a lot of trouble following what I was saying. And so I made sure, and it was kind of a difficult effort, I had to make sure that I was, always, visible in that straight kind of forward facing way. But now it's second nature, now I don't really think about it too much because I've kind of, not gone around the room and, moved around in that way. And so it's, I think, to think about like the structure of your classroom. There are a lot of things that students are relying on that are, beyond the words on a screen that, we have to kind of think about, that structure and layout.
Yeah, and even like I think about Lanigan because I teach in Lanigan a lot. Students might need to stand up and move around a little bit if you think about students with ADHD, but that would then probably require them to sit in the back or on the edges, which depending on acoustics, visibility, can then interfere. Or maybe if you think about sometimes students in the back are the ones that chat more, right? So then they're putting themselves in this context to allow themselves to get up and move, but then they're simultaneously putting themselves in a spot where they're probably more distracted by other students. So important things to think about.
I think it's also important to recognize that we don't have control over a lot of these things.
Exactly, yeah.
But on the other hand, there are things we can do that are simple
Mhm.
and straightforward. So I had a student one year who was in the back of the room in Murano, constantly distracted. He had to listen to his song to the exact, like 2.5 minutes before he could get started. And he was always late. And then he always had his headphones. And I said, so what's going on? I said, I must listen to my song. I said, how long is it? 2 minutes and 45 seconds. And I said, what if you put your clock back 5 minutes? Just leave the dining hall 5 minutes early. What time do you leave? 2:45. Leave at 2:40. Just that little hint. He sat in the back. He was always distracted. And I said, why don't you sit up front? And I switched seats with somebody.
Yeah.
It made a world of difference.
Yep.
And it just, I said, I wasn't criticizing, it was just that one shift helped him tremendously. It wasn't perfect, but we can only do so much, but if the key is recognizing it, that's
Exactly.
the key,
Yeah.
is to say something's going on here.
Yeah.
And because I know autism, like autism, we sort of know instinctively what to do or what can help. It doesn't
Yeah.
always help, but at
Yeah.
least we have some notion of it,
Yeah.
right? But, and I think the other thing to notice here is if it doesn't work, try something else. Like,
Yeah.
just don't give up. Don't say, oh, I failed and now this kid's not doing well. But say, okay, so that didn't work. All right.
Yeah, and it's
What
that
else would
idea
you
of
do?
having mercy on students, right? Because
Yeah.
sometimes social interactions or behaviors might be perceived as rude, right?
Right.
They're late, they've
Yeah.
got their headphones in, even
And it's not.
tone in email,
Right.
right? And sometimes it's a simple, friendly, helpful advice.
Yeah.
I go by Dr. Bovir, not by my first name, or not hey, comma, right?
Yeah.
So, and that was just a completely innocent, not sure how to navigate a social situation. And I learned later that the student was on the autism spectrum. It's like, okay. So you've got to just keep that in mind that, yeah, behaviors that we might perceive as disruptive or rude are part of their routine or their inability to understand neurotypical social cues. Yeah, and you're right, a lot of things are out of our control with the class environment itself. So how can we get control where we can? Or advocate for different layout of spaces when we are renovating spaces for students or requesting classrooms, if we can. Any other thoughts with this stuff? I think about that desk structure, like in Lanigan, the chairs that move back and forth and spin,
Yeah.
and or your ability to just feel comfortable in a chair, right? It's like a lot of our students might be so focused on that tactile sensation of the chair that's uncomfortable that they're not focused on class.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind.
And sometimes the student knows best. Sometimes I'm like, I want to help you. Can you teach me what to do?
Exactly.
What worked for you in high school?
Yeah.
What did your favorite teacher do to help you manage these kind of different tactile things that you're having? And sometimes that can just get the conversation started to say, I'm learning too. I just want to support you. You know, you're the expert on you. You tell me.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, I thought about, I know I have talked with some colleagues about students wearing earbuds in class. But then I thought more about it. It's like, what if they just have the earbuds in, but they're not listening to anything, but it muffles the sound just a bit to make them more comfortable, right? Like a little bit of white noise, they can still hear, they can still focus. So if you see a student, like Lynn said, just talk to the student individually, right? Don't just make them take it out in class. That could really throw a person, even if, it, you know, it might just be a student who's listening to a podcast or something and not paying attention. It is what it is. But if that additional step helps protect a student, then that's an important one to make.
So Cassie mentioned that she's very interested in ADHD and learning and how we can support these in and out of the classroom. Lots of
Sure, we can switch to
if you
ADHD
wanted-
for a little bit.
if you guys want.
So, yeah, I think you go back a little bit. Thank you. Okay, maybe one more? Nope, that's it, Okay, so again, even I have a background in clinical psychology, but I did not work with anyone who had ADHD. And then considering ADHD from this pedagogical perspective in terms of inclusive teaching is still new to me. So this is what I have learned in terms of how ADHD symptoms can interfere with academic performance. So we see that procrastination, lack of concentration, inability to self-regulate, poor planning, anxiety, social challenges, and time management, they're big takeaways. What's important to know is that, so ADHD, we have hyperactivity and inattention, right? So hyperactive behaviors and inattentive behaviors. And a study in 2009 found that inattention, as opposed to hyperactivity, is the main component that's associated with academic adjustment, career decision-making, self-efficacy, and study skills. So if we can focus on helping students with the inattention component of it, as opposed to perhaps the hyperactivity component, that's where we can help them, at least in the classroom, right, with setting them up for success. So I'll share these slides, but there's some links here in these slides that are helpful in understanding. So some students might not have a diagnosis, right? So this may have been overlooked in elementary school, high school, and they're just now getting to college and it's starting to manifest in ways that are impacting their success. So there's some links, and I'll share these with everyone on diagnosing ADHD in adults, what signs to look for if you have a student who does not necessarily have an accommodation, but because it manifests a little bit differently in adults. There's some coaching is a great way to help students with ADHD, and it mainly uses cognitive behavioral approaches. Cognitive behavioral approaches essentially teach people to identify ways in which they think and ways in which they behave, and then change those maladaptive cognitive or thought processes and maladaptive behaviors. So basically, if you want to help change negative outcomes or negative beliefs that students have about their ability, you can focus on problem solving, teaching them self-monitoring skills, modeling, right? Modeling good behavior, helping set them up with practicing of good behavior. And behavioral psychology really works, rewards and consequences, right? Positive reinforcement, that sort of helps as part of that cognitive behavioral coaching approach to students with ADHD. So that can be really helpful. What's my next slide, Maggie? Nope, that was it. Okay, so go ahead and go back. So I think these coaching approaches, and there is an article that's linked to you for specific academic coaching for ADHD, but we can just start to have a discussion on folks who've worked with students who have ADHD, thinking back to those pedagogical strategies again, if we think about assessments, we can start with learning assessments and classroom practices. Again, a lot of some of the best ways to support them are some of the same things that we've already discussed with autism spectrum in terms of clear-cut guidelines. And then I think with ADHD though, this might get into one of the ideas of like flexibility with due dates, right? How much do we consider flexibility in due dates? Like there's best by dates that you can use that give students a little bit of wiggle room if they're struggling. Some of the same challenges with disclosure. Some students are not as willing to disclose it. Another thing to consider is that many students with ADHD are on medication and might be going through changes in their medication, which can significantly impact their academic functioning. I had one who was willing to come and disclose to me and said, like, I might need an extension on this paper. Here's what happened. I had a medication switch, or my insurance didn't work for a week. And so therefore, right. So it's again, like having mercy on students and recognizing that it can really have an impact on their ability to be successful in college. Anyone have any strategies that they want to share or experiences? Yeah.
Well, I'm diagnosed with ADHD.
Okay.
Since I was fourth grade, I was diagnosed actually. I had a lot of trouble growing up, like a lot of trouble losing everything, you know, just missing the bus all the time. It was just chaos, right? But I sort of have an idea about how I was able to kind of at least like individually kind of do things. So I make sometimes suggestions to students.
Sure.
Like, you know, for instance, okay, put your phone down, put your alarm on, right? And work for like, you know, just try to work for a few minutes, then give yourself a little brain break, you know, walk around, you know, do something else, right? Brain breaks or something like I've read a lot about with ADHD, you know, because it can just get too much to try to keep the focus when your brain does not want to. It wants to go somewhere else that's more fun, you know, more novel, right? But I oftentimes try to also kind of talk to them about some of the strengths. So ADHDers are kind of good at divergent thinking is sometimes what they find. So they can come up with a lot of answers, not necessarily just one answer.
Right.
But that can be really beneficial in like group discussions or, you know, when we're talking about ideas, you know, they can sometimes generate, you know, some of those ideas a little bit more sometimes than other students. But I also try to tell them almost like, you know, talk to them about like little changes that they can make, like the, you know, the alarms even, but also try to remind them of due dates. So I do on Brightspace, I have like the due date reminders. So an announcement will go out that's like, oh, you know, the assignment is due tonight, the assignment is due then, you know, and so on. But I think flexibility is important as well. But, you know, some things I try to kind of tell them about my experience, and that does seem to help some of the students to disclose sometimes.
Sure.
Because they, you know, because I also have epilepsy. So it's been 9 years since my last seizure, so it's good. But you know, when I was here as a student, I was having seizures. And I oftentimes, you know, will disclose the ADHD thing because I think, you know, it gives students like, okay, this professor understands, you know, she, right, has this. So I oftentimes find that they do come to me and talk to me about these things. And I think in the classroom, just almost like, you know, keeping in mind that sometimes if their attention is, you know, kind of going off, right, to keep in mind like, okay, actually, hey, did you have an idea about this? But try not to cold call them, you know, but kind of give them some sort of cue, even walking by, you know, walking around the classroom can kind of keep things so their attention maybe is a little bit more focused. You know, so I think there's a few like things you can talk to them about, but it is somewhat of an individualized, I think, approach for sure.
Just to jump off of that, my son also has ADHD, and some of the, you know, you talked about standing in the back. I kind of first day of class say, you know what, I'd rather instead of your sleeping or, you know, whatever, it's hot in here, go stand in the back of the room. I go to an all-day conference and I stand in the afternoon. Because I want to pay attention and, you know, whatever. So kind of that movement, stand in the back of the room, redirection.
Yeah,
So the whole
redirection,
class
that's
needs-
exactly.
Needs that,
exactly.
you know, everyone's kind
Oh,
of going off or whatever,
absolutely.
so redirecting back here. The structure, so in the back of my syllabus, I have a map for the whole semester, so they get all their due dates with a
Mhm.
checkbox. So they can check it off, they can print it out, check it
Mhm.
off, they know that's coming up. A few semesters ago, we had one of our self-reading groups was teaching students how to learn.
Yes.
So I pulled some things from there, and I typically give a presentation in the class of, you know, check this out. See if it works for you. You know, you do this before, after, you know, right after class, you're writing down a couple of things. But checklists,
Mhm.
you know, here's the structure for everybody. Here's the beginning of this semester, I talked about data analytics mindset and critical thinking. So here's the things where you check off, you know, asking the question, you know, whatever. And again, I think that benefits everybody. But I know for my son, that's his.
Yeah, yeah.
And I want to highlight a couple things in the chat. You know, that first there was, you know, discussion about gender differences in diagnoses of ADHD that's often overlooked in girls and women. But Kristen also mentioned, you know, anything that helps students structure their work can help all students, including those with ADHD. So small assignments, checklists, as were mentioned, multi-stage papers rather than a single high-stakes paper. I also think often about, you know, any kind of videos that I'm showing in class, making sure that it's, you know, not a 30-minute video or a 20-minute video. Even when I'm conducting an asynchronous class, and there's, you know, been research about, you know, how long are students actually engaged in the material when you're showing them a video. And it's like 6 minutes or something. I think Rebecca Mushchair is on here. She could probably fact check me on that number, but you know, through you know, thinking about chunking information and you know, having it in kind of small, digestible, common themes in your content is also important. And just a quick plug, there are really awesome tools in Brightspace to make checklists. And the checklists, you know, I can send everybody, it's already on the CELT website, but we've done a couple of workshops on creating checklists. You put in the due dates, it goes right into their calendar, so it stays very visible that all those due dates are right there. I do them by module, which I have it set up as weeks. So they have a weekly checklist. They go in and make sure they've completed all of the work that I've expected them to do that particular week. I do it for my in-person and my asynchronous online courses. And, you know, there's some cool tools to, you know, kind of help students with that. But I wanted to just share that.
And with deadlines, what's interesting is that deadlines help students with autism because that's the deadline.
Yep.
That's it.
Mhm.
Where that may not be the case with someone with ADHD.
Exactly.
So I
Yeah,
build
yeah.
in assignments, not tests, because if they're in class, they can't really do
Sure.
much. But I give everybody an opportunity to say, if you need an extension, you can have an extension if you email me in advance, 24 hours in advance.
Yep.
And then everyone gets the same opportunity. So I don't want to single anybody out. Things happen, right?
Sure.
Life happens, things, you know, your dog dies, you have to go home, you didn't get a good night's rest, you
Mhm.
started your paper too late, all these things. Everyone gets a blanket extension if you ask them 24 hours in advance. And that does two things. One, you could take it or not take it, but it keeps them responsible. Like they have to ask me.
Yeah.
They
yeah.
have to request it from me, so I'm forcing them to be responsible for their own deadline. Because let's be honest, do any of us, you know, start reading the papers 5 minutes after we get them? I don't think so. I don't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We just don't. So
Yeah.
if it's a day later, does it really matter that much?
Yeah.
Maybe that relieves their anxiety just enough
Enough.
to
Exactly.
give them that little wiggle room
Yep.
that you were talking about.
Mhm.
And we're like, yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm okay with that.
Another strategy I've used is I tell students, like, if they've sort of gone a little bit beyond that reasonable
Yeah.
extension, it's do the assignment, I will grade it and I will consider it for points if this is a make or break between your letter grades at the end of the semester and you've maintained good progress. So then it motivates them to stick to those deadlines in the end, that they have an opportunity, have been empathetic to some degree while still being fair to other students. So yeah, there's lots of these individualized policies that you can have for your classroom to help set those students up.
Rebecca, Ms. Chair, also dropping lots of wisdom here. Thank you. Mentions, that working to foster a growth mindset can be really important too, because it can be easy to be less attentive to things that feel particularly hard, where we feel we can't be successful at or are discouraged by. And I'll plug for, those who, gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the presentation, but it was in the spring breakout. Kristen ran the session on, I think it was a motivating syllabus, which, was a really, she was pointing to some different toolkits. I'm sure she could jump in on that. Toolkits on how to create a growth mindset within your syllabus and, within your course, generally your communications with students and, how worthwhile that is academically. And, for students to feel connected and belonging to the class.
So we're right at 3 o'clock almost. So thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you to everyone for coming on Zoom. I think this has been a great starting point. I'd like to do more of these in the future and formalize things in different ways. But what I will do is I'll follow up with everyone with a Google form. I'd love some feedback. And then I'd also like some information from folks about what you need for continued support. So how can we set these students up for success? If you want empirical articles, we can start a repository for that, or book lists, or there's CELT workshops, there's CELT reading groups, there's podcasts, there's so many things that are available, but you might have other ideas about, hey, we really need this, or we would like to see this from the advisement center, or we'd like to see this from administration in some way. Are there any ways that we can help support each other to then help support our students? So I'll just be interested to hear what everyone has to think. All right, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.